From the Skyterra Wellness Retreat, this is the Inspired Intentions Podcast, where we help people build the skills and mindset to live a healthy life. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's episode, if you've been enjoying our podcast, take a moment to rate and review. It may seem like a small thing, but our ratings and reviews make a huge difference in the quality of our show. They help us reach more listeners like you so we can continue bringing you more amazing content. So, if you've found inspiration, learned something new, or just love tuning in every week, please rate the Inspired Intentions Podcast 5 stars and leave us a review and even share with a friend. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Now let's get into the show. Welcome back, listeners. Alan here, and I have my friend Greg in the podcast booth again. Greg, thanks for coming back.
Absolutely, man. I love being in here.
I know, it's a good place to be. We carved out some time this afternoon to record this episode all about building boundaries. I think it's something that everybody could use a little bit more of.
Oh, my goodness.
Something that you work with a lot of folks here and at our young adult program.
Yep.
And I think that you have a lot of really solid information about this. I've actually sat in on part of your Building Boundaries class that you teach here. And I am thrilled that you're going to do this for us on the podcast.
Yeah. It'll be a little different format than in class, but I think it'll just be me talking with you instead of...
Yeah.
And I think my favorite part about this class, or all my classes, really is the impact that those that are present, their lived experiences, their struggles with boundaries, their struggles with not just knowing what boundaries are, but establishing and maintaining.
Yeah.
So I'm super excited to share that here, and
I'm sure that leads to every class being a little bit different for you too, which is cool.
some a little longer, some get in trouble.
I do the same thing. I very rarely have a 50-minute class that doesn't run an hour and
So
5.
bad. I'm like looking at my watch, and I was like, guys, I'm 27 minutes over. And then they're like, yeah, you do this every time. And I was like, I'm working on it, guys. I'm trying to set the boundaries.
That's great.
All right, let's do it, man.
So I want you to kind of set the stage for us. How would you define boundaries for folks? Like, what do we actually mean by boundaries?
Man. So this is one of my fun questions I ask everyone in my class, because I think it's really cool to get a diverse expression of what boundaries are, because everyone has pretty different. I would define them as limits, guidelines, demarcations, just different kind of segmenting area as far as like property goes. But also on the other side, what is okay and what is not.
Okay.
What will I accept, will I not accept? Some of those hard and fast rules. And in that same discussion, I talk about what boundaries are not. So it's really important to delineate between boundaries are these lines, these limits, these opportunities, but they're also not control. They're not acceptance. I don't have to agree with your boundaries. You don't have to agree with mine.
Okay.
But the reality is we have to learn to respect. We have to learn to establish boundaries, identify boundaries, communicate boundaries. And so it's not just saying, hey, what are they? Because I think that's the easy part. But if we really think about boundaries just in day-to-day life, there's a speed limit on every road I've ever been on anywhere in the world. And it seems that we take our liberties to be able to exceed or go below that speed limit, depending on how we're feeling and how we want to drive, right? Age has a little bit of that. The older we get, the slower we get mentality. But at the same time, the law is always there. That boundary is always there. And when I end up exceeding that speed limit, I tend to get pretty upset when the enforcement is also there. Because I can drive most roads and not see police, not be slowed down, not have any consequence. And when I do, all of a sudden my mind goes into this weird trigger space of how dare they? How inconvenient is that for me to have to slow down when I've been able to drive this road every day and haven't had to worry about it? So it's
interesting.
It's almost like opportunity where sometimes I can do it, other times I can't. And I think we get into boundaries with humans that same way. Sometimes I'll set a boundary and I won't hold it. So someone learns, hey, I can just walk right over there. I can pass that boundary.
Yeah.
It's like drawing a line in the sand during low tide. At high tide, where's that line?
Yeah.
Gone,
Underwater.
right? And I think there's some of that reality of, if I get stuck in a space I don't like, I've, air quotes, tried to set boundaries, and I don't know how. I don't know what they are. I don't know why I can't maintain them. And so I think while this conversation feels very simple for Greg, I think it's such a deep, convoluted idea for society because there's a lot of pressures around expectations. In certain environments, I'm willing to sacrifice some of my boundaries. If I don't drink, but I'm with my drinking friends, in order to fit in, I might break my boundary, and the next time I'm with them, what are they going to say? You drank last time, man.
Yeah.
Why not do it this time?
Expectation.
You know, and so a lot of that it's the relationship, it's the norm, if you will, on a lot of that. And I think we get really confused. I think we get really, I think we get taken advantage of by our own boundaries sometimes. And I think that's where we kind of get stuck in not understanding what they are in the very beginning.
I guess what I'm also hearing is like to actually define what boundaries are. It really depends on the group of people. When we're talking about boundaries between people, the group of people you're with, it can be very vast. Like my boundaries are different with my significant other than they are with, you know, one of my coworkers.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's environmental. Yeah. It's relational. It's I think they change with age.
Sure.
I think children, the idea of setting boundaries is a little bit of a crash course, if you will. And then for adults, we're expected to have boundaries.
Yeah.
And it's like if a child tells a teacher to not yell at them, all of a sudden there's this weird authoritarian piece. Or if my kid comes to me and says, Dad, I don't like it when you yell at me, and they're setting this boundary of I won't accept being yelled at, all of a sudden I'm like, I'm your dad. Like, how dare you mentality? And I think we get stuck in that. It's like we feel controlled, we feel manipulated, we feel taken advantage of, even when we are the ones breaking someone else's boundary. And I think it gets very, very convoluted, and I think we get stuck in the weeds, or I do, when I have these conversations.
So what are we using boundaries for?
Yeah. A lot of what we run into is we find boundaries as a means of expression, boundaries as a means of protection, boundaries as a means of safety, a little bit of survival, right? If we're out in the woods and there's a bear, the boundary is going to be whatever that behavior is to keep that bear away. That bear does not speak English. That bear does not care if I'm yelling or not. If it is hungry, it's going to come after me. But the boundary is there as a means of survival, if we really simplify it to that level. Because when we think about the neuroscience of it, when there's the trigger, the brain just does its thing. It activates, it reacts. We're talking about the amygdala. And the amygdala says, do the thing, do the weird thing, do this, do the crazy thing, you know? And I think it's in those moments, we're yelling, screaming, and fighting over nothing. Or we're getting offended over nothing. We're getting offended because your beliefs are different than mine. If I have a boundary of, hey, we're not going to communicate like this at the dinner table, I better not be the one communicating like that at the dinner table.
Yeah.
Or else weird mixed messages. And so I think because boundaries become such a heavy conversation, it's really hard to simplify it down to definition of what are they.
What is it, right?
But I really think it's the variety of lines, expectations, boundaries, guidelines. Yeah.
Would you say the purpose of a boundary is to try and strive for more consistency in your life? Or would you define it differently?
I like that. I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
But in order for me to have consistency, I must be consistent.
Sure.
And so it's almost this trial episode or this trial and error type approach. But that's where you learn what your boundaries are. You learn what's okay and what's not by making mistakes.
Yeah.
And those around you crossing those boundaries and you having to hold them. Because I think if we get into some of that survival piece, doesn't matter what happens, doesn't matter what the consequence might be, I'm going to do the crazy thing. Even if that does hurt. Even if that does ruin a relationship. But that's my boundary. And we become very rigid in some of those moments because that's what the brain says to do.
So it sounds like the consistency can almost be a bad thing. It could almost be a good thing. It is again, very situational.
And I think if the consistency is rigid versus porous versus healthy, right? Rigid meaning very black and white. I'm only available during this time, and I will deny every phone call or opportunity beyond that, no matter what. Or the other side where it's porous and it's, hey, I'm available during these hours, but I'm also available any other time you need me. And then being able to find that consistency and say, my office hours are during this time, I'm here to help. And leaving it there without excuse. So I think we run into almost overextension, overindulging in some of those because I'm trying to maintain relationships. I'm trying to avoid conflict.
Right.
And I think that's where we get stuck not setting boundaries.
Sure.
Because if I set a boundary with you, Alan, and I'm worried about your reaction, I'm worried about the relationship. I'm worried about my safety. I'm worried about how we interact afterwards. But at the same time, if I set that boundary and you're okay with it, for some reason I'm shocked. like we often are very surprised when it actually works.
Yeah.
Because I think we're expecting the worst.
Why didn't he answer my text?
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Why didn't they answer? Why did they not pick up that call?
Mm-hmm.
I have a work question for them.
And then rather than boundaries, we're talking about anxieties,
Ooh,
uncertainties, different conversation.
Whole different topic. Yeah, for sure. I meet a lot of folks that have that work boundary problem, or I meet a lot of people that are retired as well, and they describe a lot of family boundaries in their retirement that it's really hard for them to define with people, or maybe they're too porous one way or the other. So I think that this is the defining it and understanding it is a really good conversation to have for any population. Yeah. Where do you think that people really get stuck at with this when they're maybe trying to define it, when they're trying to figure out what their boundaries are?
I think a lot of us, including myself, I think we get stuck in the I don't know how to do it, as you just said. But I also think it's if I don't know how to do it, where do I ever learn? And then it turns into I might as well not even try.
Interesting.
Rather than let me practice to get better, let me improve that skill, that's too much work. And so I'm just going to sacrifice.
Interesting.
I'm just going to ignore any of that hurt, that harm, because it preserves the relationship. It means that I still get to spend time with Alan rather than him dismissing me because
rather than avoiding conflict. Yeah.
100%.
And is that what you typically are working with people on?
A lot of that work is surprisingly, I don't know, maybe I'm more surprised than many people, but we've never done it before. We've never had to think about those limits, those lines in the sand as boundaries. I've told people no before. I never perceptualized that as a boundary. I've just said that's my life. That's normal. That's who I am. Yeah. And so when we start having the conversation of boundaries, people are like, oh, I know this. I know what this is. Yeah. And it's like, have you done it? Like I said no once. And it's like,
once.
Where do we take this now? So a lot of it really is rather than identifying the what, it's where am I stuck? What am I not doing right? And then we do that skill building of let's practice. Let's make a boundary. It doesn't have to mean anything, but let's construct, let's create, make space for a boundary that you can then take into society and practice.
I was going to say, so you're saying just like a small practice boundary, like basically something that you really honestly don't care if it fails or not, but you're just seeing if you can do it.
Can you do it?
Is that homework that you give people?
It's a lot of the homework. I give a lot of homework as a therapist, but a lot of it's just that introspection and identity work of being able to say, what is true to me? What limits do I need to set? Where do I, environmental, relational, work? What are some of those behaviors that I'm doing that I don't like? And what do I want to do instead? I use that for a lot of the boundary work that I do. Because if they can look back and say, this is where I got stuck in this relationship, and we bring real life examples, it's no longer I'm just doing this because I check the box and get done with the assignment. But it's, I don't want to be there again.
Yeah.
I don't want to be stuck in that environment. And so one of the things I like to do is just habit trackers. Habit trackers set these weird boundaries of my behavior. How do I want to be? Not about you. Not how do we keep ourselves safe, but what's a simple behavior I want to do around sleep, nutrition, and movement?
Yeah.
It's consistency there. Being able to say, hey, if I can get sleep consistent for 1 week, maybe I can eat consistently for a week. Maybe I can communicate a boundary that I've been working on for a long time I've needed to set and have been afraid to do. But it's practice makes better. Practice makes proficient. Practice makes practical. And I think there's a lot of this where the practice almost not necessarily erases, but pushes through the fear and the uncertainty associated with setting limits with human beings.
I love that you brought sleep up because I think that's a really interesting boundary that a lot of people don't set. And usually I get that there's outside factors, like people have kids, they have maybe jobs that take them one direction or the other late. But that's one that I would say the most with people about is why don't you have a consistent sleep schedule? why don't having you, I guess you could say, set a boundary around how much sleep is important for you, aka set a bedtime.
Correct.
Or a wake up time,
Yeah.
because those two things talk to each other, really. But that's one of the most consistent ones that I talk to people about when we're talking about setting, I guess it is setting boundaries.
Those are boundaries.
Yeah.
And those are everyday habits that we just don't focus on because they're not intentional. And I think that's a huge part of boundaries. If I'm not doing it on purpose, it's not a boundary. If I don't have, then this is, am I going to bed with or without TV? There's a boundary. Am I drinking before bed? There's a boundary. Am I eating before bed? There's a boundary. Am I eating in bed? There's a boundary. But all of that is to prepare for sleep. And I don't think we conceptualize it quite that same way because we don't think about the preparation it takes to be ready. And I don't know that it's that different with relationships, with conflict resolution, with if there's something that's just been festering and you're just like, I have to talk to Alan about this thing, but I'm worried about his reaction.
Yeah.
I am essentially avoiding that conversation and that boundary and opportunity to grow.
Yeah, I think if you're worried about the conflict, like the sleep example might be easier to actually conceptualize and execute on because it's not hurting anybody but you,
right? Versus
the conflict that might ensue from talking to Alan about the thing that's bugging you.
Yeah,
you know. So I get that. You know what? I'm curious. This like idea of homework, like the little things that you might ask somebody to try. What are some of the stuff that you've given people?
One of my fun ones is use adult words. That's the boundary. Because I had this weird experience where I was out in the field as doing community mental health, and there was this older lady, and she was trying to identify behaviors of her grandchildren that she was concerned about, and I was so confused, and it was weird for me to have to be there and say, "Grandma, we're not going to communicate like that," and it was a stranger. I didn't know how she's going to react, and at the same time, we've got to figure out how to just address the very simple pieces like that. So when I think about that's a very extreme piece.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when I talk to parents and children, whether your child is 8, 18, or 80 years old, we have to be able to be direct, we have to be clear, and we have to say, what are the words I want you to hear? Because there's a lot of venting, there's a lot of mumbling, there's a lot of just talk that doesn't get anywhere. And if someone's just talking at me, I'm probably not listening.
Yeah.
And the boundary could be, hey, when we interact, I want to see you taking notes. When we're interacting, I want to see you have your phone down, right? And it's those boundaries become so simple, but they're also quintessential to success in a lot of those relationships because what we're used to hearing is put your phone away. All of a sudden it's a consequence. Or stop yelling at me, or stop hitting your sister, or stop kicking my seat, whatever it might be. And all we're doing is telling them what we don't want to see rather than I want to see this. And so it's about relation. And in those conversations, I think it's opportunity in the homework to be able to say, what's a boundary you can set in the gym? What's a boundary you can set at the dinner table at Skyterra Wellness? And a lot of it's around conversations.
Yeah.
A lot of it's around personal space. A lot of it's around some of that emotional availability. You know, if someone comes and says, hey, can we chat for 10 minutes? If I don't have it, I have to be able to set a boundary that says, Alan, I would love to be able to support you right now, and I just don't have it in me.
That's so hard.
That's the difficulty. Why am I worried about it? Because I don't know how you're going to respond if I reject you. And that becomes the concern around the relationship. And I think in that same space, how can we provide support to both?
Yeah.
Like, how can I say no, but not reject?
Right.
And how can I say no and establish that communication? Hey, I don't have time now. Looks like tomorrow is my best availability. Would that work?
Yeah.
If it's not going to work, they have to reject you. That's the truth of it.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think it's not to manipulate, not to reverse the script, but to be able to clarify, I'm not available now, and here is when I am. Because if we were in the grocery store and I see you and you have this, I don't know, sad look on your face, if I'm like, hey, you got to tell me what's up, and you're just like, I'm not going to do that. All of a sudden, weird dynamics happen. And that happens here when someone's not feeling great, when someone's not engaging in classes. There is concern because we have a relationship. But if we say, hey, what's up? And then they start sharing, I better be available. I better be ready becomes that the norm. And I think that's where we get stuck in all those avenues of advocation, of being able to say no, being able to set limits, being able to just kind of temper down the expectations that people have of us. by normalizing that we can't do all of it.
We want boundaries for consistency in our lives. We typically, boundaries with people, don't have them because we don't want to let people down.
100%.
Is that what I'm hearing?
I think one of the, I don't know if you know of Brene Brown. She
Familiar, yeah.
She has a very simple quote that says, "Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others." That does not say daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to deny someone else.
Yeah.
It's for me.
Yeah.
Boundaries are for me.
Sure.
Your boundaries are for you. What I really love is when boundaries are mutual and flexible. And one of the phrases I love, if it's not good for both, it's good for neither. If my boundary harms you,
Yeah.
it's probably not a boundary. If it manipulates you, if it changes you, but if it's about safety, it's a different conversation. And it's that reality, though, of in order to maintain my boundary, I can't hurt you. It may hurt your feelings. It may not be comfortable. But if I'm not trying to harm you and you feel hurt and my intention is whole, then that becomes something completely separate to process.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we start worrying about.
I feel like that version is easier to figure out with that individual because if it's pure, it's more of a conversation. Interesting.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about actually setting boundaries in our lives, how do we know if we're actually successful? Like, if we know that we have a conflict with someone, that like thing that you really need to talk to them about that they've been doing, and you try and set that boundary, at what point do you know that it's successful? And maybe the question is actually, when it backfires, how do you rebound from that too? Do you see what I'm saying?
I love it.
Because there's two sides to it, right?
Absolutely. So I think a lot of it is trusting your gut.
Okay.
Being able to trust your intuition, being able to look in the mirror and say, I said the thing, I am trying, I am addressing it. I can't control them. If I'm doing my part, I believe they become successful. If I'm trying to control them so that my plan is successful, we're a couple steps too far. That makes sense?
Yeah, so success is not based off of whatever actions the person you're trying to set the boundary with takes.
Correct.
Success is just that you actually tried to set the boundary.
Did I say it? Did I name it? Did I evaluate? Did I say, is that the right boundary to set? Did I take the time to make sure it is clear and direct? Did I do what I needed to do?
Because that's what you can control.
100%.
But then somebody comes back at you again, and it's
and what
the same
do you
thing.
Do? Because one of the fun parts is I get to teach people how to hold boundaries, how to address boundary violations, is what I call them.
Okay.
Right? Where when I set a boundary, hey, don't touch my belongings. This is my stuff. I'd love for you to leave it alone. And someone crosses that, I get to say, hey, I want to remind you of my boundary. I'm not going to call you out and discipline you and say, hey, you did the thing again. I'm going to remind of my boundary with a very simple statement. I want to remind you this is my stuff and we're going to keep our hands off. Rather than attacking. Because when someone attacks, the threat is going to result in survival, fight, flight, freeze. Get this weird little conflict and we don't know what to do about it.
We want to avoid the conflict. A really simple version that popped in my head, I was thinking about like what in my life is like a stupid, simple boundary that we have, and it's take your shoes off when you come in.
100%. In some cultures, incredibly disrespectful.
Incredibly.
In other homes, inconvenience.
Inconvenient, like, yeah you get
my home was like that too growing up.
Get the carpet dirty. Yeah. But you walk into our house, you take your shoes off.
Yeah.
I remind people consistently to do that because I have a big friend group that's always coming over, you know, and it becomes irritating how many times you have to say it, but it's not one that I'm willing to budge on.
Yeah.
So I just kind of have to keep on going over it. I guess I'm answering my own question there when I was like, well, what if somebody doesn't do it? You just have to keep trying.
And then somebody put up signs.
Yeah.
Put up a sign that says, hey, shoes off at the door. Common sense, I found, is not quite as common as we think. If I walk into a home and I see a bunch of shoes at the front door, I might wonder, hey, should I take my shoes off?
Right.
I might ask, hey, Alan, do I need to take my shoes off? Some people don't pay attention to any of that. And that's okay. But it does require us, if that is something, is that a boundary that we really want to hold, we must be willing to voice it. And if the simpler it is, the easier it is to repeat. If it's a whole paragraph, No one's listening.
Yeah.
Like, hey, shoes off at the door, please. Great. A lot of people will respect that.
Yeah.
And I think it's that simple, but at the same time, it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's irritating. We still have an emotional reaction to it. And at the same time, that friend, hopefully over time, as your consistency follows through, they learn, oh, you're right. Let me take my shoes off. They'll back up to the door, take them off. And then over time, they take their shoes off.
Yeah, and if it's not something that's within their boundaries, they don't do it at their house.
It's not familiar.
I get it. I get that that's hard.
And it's that way with communication styles. Hey, I'm not going to have people yell at me. People will yell. And if I yell back, I'm breaking my boundary.
Any other ways to maybe define success? Is that like your main focus?
That's like the big one.
Yeah.
I think success, if I feel okay,
Mm-hmm.
if I feel good about what's happening in my environment, my boundaries are working.
What would failure look like? Not
feeling good.
Never saying it in the first place.
Not feeling confident. And I think like the emotional side would be, do I feel good about it or not? If I don't feel good, something's wrong. Intuition, got to follow that gut.
Yeah.
And if I never say them, if I don't say them, or if I don't say them clear enough, they're going to fail. When you're on an airplane, Alan, and that kid behind you is kicking your seat, a couple of options.
Yeah.
Swing your arm back and smack the feet. Hopefully it sends a message. Say, hey, stop kicking my seat. Reach over to mom. Hey, mom, can you get your kid to stop? None of those are your control. That kid's going to do whatever he wants.
Right.
What I've learned from my own kids, if I say, hey, don't hit your sister, my kid's going to go and slug his sister because that's what they hear. If I'm able to say, hey, hands to yourself. Hey, let's keep our feet down. Hey, let's engage. Let's play a game. Let's not do that. Like all of a sudden, the brain has to think of something else to do, and we're giving the directive. We're going to communicate calmly in here rather than no yelling. Because the minute someone says no yelling, I'm going to push the button. And now I'm going to poke the bear. And I'm going to do the things because that's part of my personality. That's not about boundaries. But it's also almost maybe a little bit about let me push that boundary knowing that someone's trying to set a boundary. But it's fun. We like fun. We don't like boring. When the kid's kicking the seat, he's having fun. You stopping him is ruining his fun. So we've got to find something else to do to engage in.
Replacement.
Or else we start getting stuck in the frustrations, the overwhelm, the disappointment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of ways we could all apply this in our lives. I think there's a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of conversations that we never have that 10 years down the road we wish we would have had 10 years ago. I'm sure you see and hear that a lot.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really good, well laid out way to kind of process that. As far as this topic of, building boundaries, is there anything else you want people to know?
For a very simple 5-piece, maybe a 5-step process.
Okay.
Number 1, know your limits. Know what you will and will not accept. Number 2, identify your boundary. What is your boundary? What does it sound like? What are the words? Is it clear and direct? The next is to evaluate. Is it working?
Okay.
The next would be let me either continue it or let me readdress and restate.
Mold it.
Then you get 5 as the maintain, the consistency. One of the things we run into when you start telling people over and over again, we start repeating. And when someone says why, like I don't like people yelling at me. Why not? It's common sense to be able to be like, oh, no one likes being yelled at. But if I start giving every different excuse every time someone says why, then I'm giving ammunition. I'm giving people opportunities to respond. If I repeat the same thing over and over again, hey, we're going to keep our hands down. Hey, we're going to keep our hands down. It starts feeling robotic. It also gets really boring for them to continue to fight.
Yeah.
And if I'm not giving them anything to push against, they fall. And I think that's a really simple piece of when you have these boundaries, make sure they're simple.
Yeah.
Make sure they're clear, direct, and as kind as you can be. And also try to stick to the facts. What is it you want them to do? And repeat that. Because then there's no question.
Number 1. Yeah.
If they've heard it, they've heard it. And you might have to say, hey, will you help me understand that you know my boundary? And if they repeat it in any form, yeah, it's dumb, but you want me to keep my hands down, great.
Take your shoes off the door.
Let's move forward.
Yeah.
rather than getting stuck. Because we love getting stuck because that's what our body finds a little bit of sensory reactive to.
That's good. Solid advice, man. Listeners, you heard it from the executive clinical director himself,
There we go.
Greg. Greg, that's great information. I'm happy that we got to kind of break down your building boundaries class a little bit. I think a lot of listeners will find value in that. If you don't have anything else to add, listeners, if you have any questions for Greg, you can reach out to us. You know our email by now, inspiredintentions@skyterrawellness.com.
Let me throw one piece out there really
we
quick.
got one more. Okay.
2 resources I want to throw out there.
Oh, resources.
Okay?
I love that.
The first is a book called Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend. A lot about the structure of boundaries, what they are, how to set them, how to maintain them.
Repeat that one.
Yep, that's the book Boundaries by Dr. John Townsend and Dr. Henry Cloud.
Amazon? Can we find it on Amazon?
We can.
Okay.
It's a good one. It's a book with a pencil on the front of it. That's all you need to know. The other piece, Dr. Henry Cloud has a podcast that is just about boundaries from successful individuals who share their own stories. He has like 400 something episodes right now, but it's the boundaries.me podcast, found wherever you find your podcast, including the Inspired Intentions podcast, but it's boundaries.me podcast with Dr. Henry Cloud.
Not only can you email us, you have more resources. I love that. That's great.
There we go.
Greg, thanks so much for coming on and doing this.
You bet, man. Thanks for having me.
What do you think our next topic should be?
Oh my goodness. Probably something that brings me back.
Something that brings you back. I think we have a few of those. We have a few. Cool. We'll go down the list. Listeners, we'll have Greg back on. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll get you all next Monday.
The Inspired Intentions podcast is a production of Skyterra Wellness Retreat. Special thanks to our executive producer, Alan Broyhill. Send us your questions and comments to inspiredintentions@skyterrawellness.com. Subscribe on iTunes and everywhere podcasts can be found. If someone you know might benefit from this podcast, share Inspired Intentions with them and give us a 5-star rating. Join us next week as we cut through the unrealistic noise on diets and fitness and show you how healthy living fits seamlessly into your already busy life. Thanks for listening.